It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to our next session. The next session will be focusing on political theology and peace, and our first speaker will be Silvana Rabinovich. She's a full professor in the Institute for Philological Research at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, one of the largest universities in the world. She has widely published on the thought of Emmanuel Levinas and the possibility of engaging recent political thoughts through the ethical lenses of midrashic and biblical text. Her recent work deals with counter-hegemonic forms of reading that embrace fragility as hermeneutic key and translation as a form of decolonial theologies. Her books, she is very productive, so she published just 2 English books in 2022, Biblical Figures in Israel's Colonial Political Theology, and in 2024, Notes for Decolonial Political Theology. Both books I've not yet heard before, but both sounds very interesting to myself. I do not know Silvana, but we just discovered we have a common friend, Ephraim Lee, a specialist on Levinas. Silvana is so productive that in her family she is called Silvanos. She always goes forward. Her talk will be A Promised Land to Bury God, Mimetic Violence in the Final Throes of Apocalyptical, Colonial, Political Theology. We are all looking forward, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Welcome. So I'll start. A Promised Land to Bury God, Mimetic Violence in the Final Throes of Apocalyptic, Colonial, Political Theology. I apologize, my English is not good. I thank David Garcia Ramos for translating my text. So you must tolerate my English. Eternally obvious. I will begin by giving the floor to the other, yielding the first word to him and also committing mine to him. I write what follows under the sign of hospitality, that is to say, of the listening that precedes the justice of the other, expressed in the pneumatic metaphor that is inspired the word, in the sense of the Levinasian prophetic animal, the one that lends its mouth to make the voice of the other heard, not to reveal the future, but to demand justice. I must clarify my locus of enunciation, that of a Jewish woman who assumes her responsibility for the justice of the other, not my justice for the other, the justice of the other, that means maybe what is just for me is unjust for him, what is right for me from his point of view is a privilege. So this justice of the other is inherited from the biblical prophets. Thus, the voice that I will listen to below alternates the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish with some echoes that return from the ruins. These echoes amplify the creaking of the last throes of a colonial theological political apparatus that is now grounded in Gaza. I once wrote that Palestine is the sounding board of the violence that is rampant throughout the world. Today, in an unleashed apocalyptic impulse, Israel's national, colonial, theological, political apparatus makes the poles of mimetic violence collide. In response to the convocation of this meeting, I will present below a counterpoint of voices in 4 tenses. 1, the desire that insists among the ruins. 2, the ruined idea of the promised land. 3, our ruinous time as the scene of the last throes of Israel's national colonial political theology, and 4, the extreme vulnerability at the end of the ruinous Mimetic part. One among the ruins, desire. Let's listen to Rabinovich in front of the ruins of Albirue, his native village, which he had to leave when he was 7 years old, and which was destroyed in the Nakba in 1948, standing before the ruins of Albirue. Like birds, I tread lightly on the earth's sky, so as not to wake the dead. I shut the door to my emotions to become my other. I don't feel that I am a stone sighing, as it longs for a cloud. Thus, I tread as if I am a tourist and a correspondent for a foreign newspaper. Of this place, I choose the wind, I choose absence to describe it. Absence that neutral around me. The crow saw it, had my two companions. Let us experience this place our own way. Here, a sky fell on stone and bled it and bled it, so that anemones would bloom in the spring. Where is my son now? Here, the gazelle broke the glass of my window, so that I would follow it. So, where is my son now? Here, the magical morning butterflies carried the path to my school. So, where is my son now? Here, I added the horse to fly to my stars. So, where is my son now? I say to my two companions, stop, so that I may wake the place, and its emptiness with Jahidi goats, full of horses and departure. For every rhyme we will pitch the tent, for every home to be stormed by the wind, there is a rhyme. But I am the son of my first dream. My milk is warm in my mother's breast. The bed is swung by two tiny birds. My father is building my tomorrow with his two hands. I didn't grow up, and so did not go to Israel. The tourist says, wait for the dog to finish its coin. I say, it knows me and I know it, but the letter has not arrived. The journalist interrupts my secret song. Do you see that dairy factory behind that strong pine tree? I say, no, I only see the gazelle at the window. He says, what about the modern roads on the rubble of houses? I say, no, I don't see them. I only see the garden under them, and I see the cobweb. He says, dry your 2 tears with a handful of fresh grass. I say, that's my other crying over my past. The tourist says, the visit is over. I haven't found anything to photograph except a ghost. I say, I see absence with all its instruments. I touch it and hear it. It lifts me high. I see the ends of my distant skies. Whenever I die, I notice I am born again, and I return from absence to absence. Rabinovich, translated by Silvana. To become once another, to speak in three, is the way to face the desired return out the homecoming under the undesirable presence of absence. The homeland and ruins become sweet for one who returns from the Nakba, and only the tourist and the foreign correspondent tie their other to the subsoil. The spectral legal classification of present absentees is an oxymoron. It makes dispossession into law. The photographic lens of the one who returns, le revenant, the ghost, reveals the image from the negative. It sees what on paper and in the light can be seen. Faced with the ruins of his hometown, the returning forward sees only the living memory that persists, just as he was forced to live it. To describe it, he chooses absence. I quote, I choose absence to describe it. absence sat neutral around him. Among the rules, the desire for life reveals itself as indestructible in the face of an unstoppable apparatus of death. The returnee unfolds triggers himself to protect the living flesh of his nostalgia, his pain idea of the return nostos. He becomes at the same time his other, a tourist and a foreign journalist. The song, the rhyme, evokes the emptiness, the disconsolation before the going that is usually at the beginning of the Mu'allaqat, the oaths of the time before Islam, known as Jahiliyyah, meaning ignorance. This emptiness, I quote, full of horses and barter, also evokes the sin of the Nakba, the forced departure due to expulsion. A rhyme for every home to be stormed by memory. The figure of the present absence is in addition to alluding to the spectrum speaks of death in life. Therefore, if the return from the Nakba has the sense of rebirth before the ruins of Al-Birwe in 1996, the return so desired to the poet was revealed as a repetition of absence. 2. The ruined biblical figure, a promised land to bury God, in the land that was promised to the patriarch Abraham for his descendants, that of the firstborn Ishmael and his second son Yitzhak. In 1948, the sons of Yitzhak expelled the sons of Ishmael, giving them the paradoxical status of present absentees. Noch ein internally displaced persons or, in other words, exiled at home. Let's see the definition of the law. And here is the map of Al-Birwe and the kibbutz Elias, or you will see it after. Now, let's see the definition of the law. Now, see the Israeli absentee property law of 1950 is the main law in a series of laws that regulates the treatment of property belonging to Palestinians who left, were forced to flee, or were deported during the 1948 war. These Palestinian refugees left behind a great deal of property, and the absentee property law has served as the legal basis of transferring such property into the possession of the State of Israel. The definition of absentee applies to anyone residing in any of the countries listed in the absentee property law: Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq, Yemen, or parts of Palestine that are outside the 1948 borders of the State of Israel. At any time between 29 November 1947 and the day on which it shall be declared that the state of emergency shall cease to exist. It further applies to a person who had or received a citizenship or nationality of those countries during this period, and anyone who merely departed for a short time between 29 November 1947 and 1st September 1948 from her ordinary place of residence in Palestine to another place in Palestine that was held at the time by anyone fighting against Israel, and then returned to her home shortly afterwards. Due to the fact that the declaration of a state of emergency in Israel is still valid, the absentee property law continues to apply to this day to those defined as absentee. Absentee property, if a person is an absentee, any property that she owns or has a right to located inside Israel automatically becomes absentee property. The actual existence of a property in Israel is key in determining that person is an absentee. And how should we define property? Similar to the definition of absentee, this definition is also extremely broad and includes, for example, land, any kind of building or other structure, any movable property, money and stocks, etc. A well-known issue is in this context is the problem of president absentees, or those individuals who departed to a particular place and consequently became absentees, returned after a short while to Israel, and even became Israeli citizens. Under the absentee property law, their properties were still considered absentee properties. So they are not permitted to live in their own homes. Mahmoud Darwish's family was forced to leave Al-Bidwe on June 11, 1948. A year later, they returned, but their village lays under a kibbutz. Their return was as present absentees. In a letter to the poem Samih al-Qasim, dated on June 3, 1986, Darwish recalls his first experience in front of the ruins of Al-Birwe. I said, when I performed the first pilgrimage ritual to my original village, Al-Birwe, I found only the carob tree and the abandoned church, and a cowhand who spoke neither clear Arabic nor broken Hebrew. Who are you, sir? I am from Kibbutz Yesbur, he answered. I said, where is Kibbutz Yesbur? Here? Here is Al-Birwe, he said. Where is Al-Birwe? I said, here, under us, around us, above us, here and everywhere. He said, but you don't see anything, not even stones. And this church, don't you see it? He said, this is not a church, it is a stable for cows. These are some Roman ruins. I said, and from where did you come, sir? From Yemen. And what are you doing here? He said, I'm returning to my country. Then he asked me, and where are you from? I said, I am from here. I am returning to my country. It's very interesting to explore the story behind the name of the kibbutz chosen by the settlers, Yesbur. In its earliest days, the kibbutz was first established quite close to the Mediterranean Sea. The name Yesbur symbolizes the vision of the original pioneers who planned to make their living in the fish industry. Yesbur is a type of seabird that excels in both swimming and diving. In addition, the kibbutz is shaped similarly to the shape of a bird. Another story says that several of the original Hungarian members first reached Cyprus and were forced to wait there before being allowed to sail to Palestine. When they reached their homeland safely, they never forgot the pattern birds, similar to albatros, that flew over their boats, which they were convinced had protected them during their rough journey. When several of these Zionist refugee pioneers became the founding members of this kibbutz, they remembered the patterns that watched over them as they sailed the Roman Sea, struggling to reach their destination, and decided to call their new home Yesbur, in reference to those beautiful and magical and protective seabirds. The encounter narrated by Rabinovich in his letter to the poet suggests two elegant metaphors for the traditional ways of relating to the land that distinguished the Palestinians from the Jews who came as refugees from Europe. The carob tree of Al-Birwe versus the petal of Yesbur. The rootedness of the original population is distinguished from the plight of the culture and religion that flourished in exile. In the narration of Darwish, in his letter, we can hear a competition of returns, which was aggravated between right and law. The Jew, who wished to return by law, encouraged by the law of return, which since 1950 invites every Jew to adopt Israeli citizenship after a millenary return, and the Palestinian, native of the land, claimed his right to return to it, which which was confiscated after the expulsion of 1948. The most important claim of the Palestinian people since the Nakba, unassailable, has been the right of return. The law of return is based on the biblical promise to the patriarch Ibrahim, whose firstborn, as you will recall, was Ishmael. In a profoundly anti-colonial poem written by Rabinovich in 1992 for the 500th anniversary of the conquest of America, an Indian asked about Columbus. Then, why does he still see this annihilation from his grave to its end? That's why, he points out, so do not bury God in books that promise you a land in our land, as you claim, and do not make your God a chamberlain in the royal court. So take your time to kill God. Before the ruins of time in Gaza, mimetic violence in the final throes of apocalyptic colonial political theology. I quote Darwish. Yes, no, it's the we do injustice when we wonder what made Gaza into a myth. If we had dignity, we would break all our mirrors and cry or curse it if we refuse to revolt against ourselves. We do injustice to Gaza if we glorify it, because being enchanted by it will take us to the edge of waiting, and Gaza doesn't come to us. Gaza does not liberate us. Gaza has no horses, airplanes, magic wands, or offices in capital cities. Gaza liberates itself from our attributes and liberates our language from its Gazas at the same time. When we meet it in a dream, perhaps it won't recognize us, because Gaza was born out of fire, while we were born out of waiting and crying over abandoned homes. It is true that Gaza has its special circumstances and its own revolutionary traditions, but its secret is not a mystery. Its resistance is popular and firmly joined together and knows what it wants. It wants to expel the enemy out of its clothes. The relationship of resistance to the people is that of skin to bones and not a teacher to students. Resistance in Gaza did not turn into a profession or an institution. To expel Girard before Gaza, as described by Darwish, I think, in Battling to the End, when Girard views with concern the escalation of extremes as a result of the political inability to contain the reciprocal growth of violence. There he dares to affirm the responsibility of Europe, of Germans and French, but we are Britain since 1916, for the devastation that is taking place for our extremes have to become the whole world. I quote Girard. We are the ones who created the Duncan and lit the fuse. If someone had said that Islamism would be the successor of the Cold War, there he states that war is, I quote, the only engine of technological progress. The fact is that technological advances, even if they are initially designed for life, they lead to war like the atomic bombs. The Girardian preoccupation with the calculation of probabilities as a relief of the apocalyptic imagination and war as the engine of progress is reminiscent for the Andersian COV&R idea of the time of the end, which differs from the end of time insofar as there is God on the horizon of this apocalyptic. The time of the end announces that what he fears, the end of time, for he only glimpses an apocalypse without kingdom. So he pretends to postpone it under the mirage of progress. Thus, he remains indefinitely on the edge of the end, dreaming or living in a kingdom without apocalypse. There is something of the mimetic principle that resonates in the poet's text. This interplay between imitator and imitated, especially when the imitator recognizes in his intimacy the intimated, hating him. The clearest case is that of the immigration forced by European Zionism of Jews coming from Arab countries. Zionist Orientalism was not able to appreciate the promise that came in the religious experience of these Jews, which came from having lived for more than a millennium in Muslim environments. Their experience of life in the language that would receive them in Palestine. And today we are facing a war of extermination, a supraliminal situation that the global South, through South Africa, and the most authorized prosecutor before the Hague, he accuses an undisputed genocide. The supraliminal is Gunter's concept. Here, the Girardian interpretation resonates. Only the ethical relationship could still found something, but it is literally overtaken by events, by the mimetic avalanche of individuals who believe themselves to be free and cling furiously to their false differences. This is Girard. This avalanche is contagious. It causes moral frameworks which themselves and very ancient rituals origin to explode. This is the driving force behind the wars of extermination. These individuals who take the most atavistic chauvinism to extremes through the mass media and artificial intelligence encourage and sustain the escalation to extremes. It's Girard. Girard refers to the difficult term terrorism as it was done after September 11, 2001. I quote, terrorism is the finished form of what Clausewitz identified and theorized with the term partisan warfare. It derives its effectiveness from a primacy of defense over attack. At one point, it is justified as being no more than a response to an aggression. It is then founded on reciprocity, reciprocal action and mimetical principle concern the same reality. Reciprocal action simultaneously provokes and defers escalation to extremes. Now, Derrida was quick to point out the autoimmune component inherent in the category that would mark the escalation to extremes. If not understood as part of the very system he attacks, the terrorist becomes Homo sapien. Girard points out there the paradox of Clausewitz. The conqueror desires peace, the defender desires war. It's Girard. European colonialism, in the mouth of its agent in Palestine, proclaims peace while it profits with the means of war. For its part, the resistance of the colonized manifests itself as a desire for war. But here, the problem is how to understand the law of desire. The double mediation of the escalation to extremes activates the paradox that sustains René Girard his structural violence. And René Girard once sharply, I quote, since it is always difficult to know who attacks first, in a way, it is always the one who does not attack. It is exactly as in certain criminal cases in which the victim, much more than the accused, is the real culprit. Before quote, the massacres of civilians, Mr. Girard, that we are witnessing are yet another superficial disaster expressing the impossibility of resolving violence through violence, or violently expelling reciprocity. Polarization over expiatory victims has become impossible, so that mimetic rivalries are unleashed in a contagious way without any time being able to avoid them. For its part, in recent days, the historian Enzo Traverso alluded in another way to a certain reciprocity. I quote, Hamas terrorism is the dialectical reverse of the terrorism of the Israeli state. Terrorism is never beautiful or exciting, but that of the oppressed is generated by that of terrorists. Terrorists who kill children in the kibbutz are repugnant, but snipers who kill children in the street or blow up a humanitarian convoy are no less so. Both must be condemned. The fact is that we cannot equate the violence of a national liberation movement with that of an occupying army, because their legitimacy is not the same. The crime of the former lies in the use of unlawful means, that of the latter in the very purpose from which it derives. To postulate the ethical superiority of armies over terrorist groups is a prejudice that history has refuted countless times, as Traverso. As Darwish said, I revolt, the relationship of resistance to the people is that of skin to bones and not a teacher to students. This gives substance to the quotation from Jean that Traverso recalls. I don't know how I will. 10 minutes maybe. Okay. So, Jean quotes by Traverso. Freedom and dignity to be such must be conquered through violence. Once again, why? I'm not afraid to introduce here the taboo topic of revenge, which Fanon avoids. Vengeful violence, unlike oppressive violence, creates negative equality and equality in suffering. Repressive violence is the negation of equality and thus of man. Revolutionary violence is highly humane, says Jean. I know it is difficult to get used to this idea, but it's important to examine it, if only in the ethereal realm of speculation. If we extend Fanon's metaphor to the oppressed, the colonized, the concentration camp prisoner, perhaps even the South American wage slave must be able to see the feet of the oppressor in order to humanize himself, and vice versa, so that the oppressor, who is not human, when he plays his role, humanizing himself. It's Jean. The responsibility of Europe and the United States, of the arms manufacturers who present themselves as champions of peace in democracy. I quote Traverso, they really demand respect for humanitarian law, but continue to supply arms to Israel and refuse to condemn a war aimed at perpetuating an illegal occupation. The double standards adopted with Ukraine and Palestine international law invoked against Russia and then ignored when it is Israel that tramples it underfoot, aroused incomprehension and indignation everywhere. Now for vulnerability and at the end of the ruinous mimetic path. At the end of the escalation of the extremism, the last word to the point. A reading script by Rabinovich, translated by Fabio Julia. Let's presume now that we, the enemy and I, fell from the air into the hole. What might happen? A reading script. In the beginning, we wait for luck. The rescuers might find us here and toss a safety rope our way, and he'd say, me first, and I'd say, me first, and in vain would curse each other out before the rope reaches. The script says, a selfish optimist, a selfish optimist, will whisper to myself without wondering what my enemy whispers to himself. He and I are partners in one trap, and in the probability game, we wait for the rescue rope so we can part ways. By the edge of the hole, the chasm, and go survive. He and I are frightened and don't exchange any word about fear or other than fear since we are foes. What might happen if a snake were to appear to us here out of one of the scenes and hiss before swallowing the two frightened ones, he and I? The script says we will partner up in killing the snake to survive together or alone. Yet we will share a phrase of gratitude and congratulations on what we have accomplished together, even if it was instinct and not us that defended itself, and instinct has no ideology. And we did not converse. I remember the law of communication over mutual frivolity, when he once told me, what has become mine is mine, and what is yours and mine. And when time is sung as soap bubbles, boredom and silence broke what's between us, and he asked me, what now? I said, not much, let's write the possibilities. He said, where will hope come from? I said, from the air. He said, did you forget I buried you in a hole like this? I said, I almost did, because an alluring warlord tomorrow pulled me by the hand. He said, will you negotiate with me now? I said, over what now in this hole, this grave? He said, over your share and mine, of our void and our mutual grave. I said, what's the use? Time has run away from us, and destiny doesn't follow the rule. The murderer and his murderer sleep in this hole, and another poet must sing this script to its end. Thank you.
Remain in the field of peace ethics, politics of peace, and our next speaker I know already through some conferences. It's Duncan Morrow, a lecturer in politics, particularly in the fields of conflict resolution, the Northern Ireland situation, ethnic confrontations, and the relationship between religion and politics through the lens of Mimetic theory. His recent publications include Reconciliation and After in Northern Ireland, The Search for a Political Order in an Ethically Divided Society, and also Violence Unveiled in Mimesis and Autónoma. Duncan Morrow is in cover circles very well known. He comes from the conflict area of Northern Ireland, and one of his teachers was Rule Captain. He comes from a field that Girard very seldom touched themselves, from directly involvement in conflict, directly involvement in politics. Duncan was also a member of the National Parliament in Northern Ireland, so there's also some political experience. So we are also looking very much forward to his talk, and his talk will be on the far side of revenge, pursuing peace in an age of polarization. And I think answers to that question are highly needed in our world. We look forward to your talk, Duncan.
Thank you very much, Duncan. And thank you very much, Silvana, for bringing us properly, I think, into the atmosphere of what we're talking about, which is that this is something which extends past the academy and exists in the real world. And in the real world, it doesn't look anything like it does on a piece of paper. And I think you brought us into the really acute dilemmas that are living out there now as we speak. First of all, I thank you for inviting me again to speak to you. It's always a privilege. I look forward to it as an opportunity both to talk with friends, but also to reflect on these themes and their relevance. I come at this, obviously, or maybe in my own mind, as an increasingly convinced Girardian. So I probably am a bit of a partisan, so I'm happy again to take any questions or thoughts that arise from that. But first of all, for locating this, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Duncan Morrow, and I've lived most of my life in Belfast, Northern Ireland. Officially, I'm a professor of politics. I have to say officially because my interest in peace and conflict, and how hope lives amid hopelessness, and what opportunities exist for making a future together, have been informed and more often than not diverted me from my strictly academic tasks, or to put it another way, my context became part of this text of my studies. And some of this will be reflected in what I have to say. I made an early decision to return to Northern Ireland after studying outside because I had the possibility of being part of a group of people, mostly in the academic sphere, all of whom were committed not only to studying conflict, but to exploring together how to get out of it. This was a life as necessarily reflective practice, as we took steps, stumbled from our strange position in Northern Ireland society. We, and our more profound the group together, took steps without any clue about our impact, but simply knew that something had to be done, which I would now say was in mimesis with their conviction that reconciliation was in mimesis with reconciliation of their conviction for reconciliation, rather than with the rapidly disintegrating society around them. At one level, we were drawn inevitably into politics and the pursuit of a political system that could hold people together who had been in conflict, if not at war with each other for centuries, simply by being there. But always we were in there from another place. I now think, and I'm speaking of the group of friends I worked with, that we had two additional resources. Firstly, we stemmed from a small, not important, and I'm not exaggerating, community of people who in the midst of violence had dedicated their lives to Christian reconciliation. Against the grain of everything that went before in Northern Ireland, they intentionally bridged the cleft between Catholic and Protestant that had defined social, political and religious life forever. Taking advantage of a small window of liberal optimism, they were motivated by the conviction that the Church Catholic, that all they claimed to, had to change. And in Ireland, that meant upending the claims to mutual exclusion that had driven their relationships since the Reformation and the incorporation by force of Ireland into the British realm. There was no well-trodden path to Autónoma, but they were coloured by another reality in the personal history of their leader. The founder of this small community had found himself in Dresden as a prisoner of war, in fact as a chaplain of the British Army, on the night the British bombed Dresden, a city of no strategic importance, where hundreds of thousands of refugees were sheltering, and 100,000 people around approximately were killed in firebombs in one night. 100,000 people. Ray, for that was his name, emerged from that night with a vague but absolute conviction that only Christian community, and I use the word Christian here in very specific concept, which I'll come back to, could respond to the scale of the crisis he witnessed at first hand. A conviction, one conviction, in the face of 100,000 incinerated people. So what? The other much later key for us was the work of Rabinovich, as mediated to us by three disciples from the Netherlands who were as practical in their judgment as René was academic in his French way. René came to us not as theory, but through the direct value of his insights for our lived predicaments as people together, as people living in a society in open meltdown, and as people trying to articulate a form of faith that made sense. His insights into the relationality of all human life and of our desires. The way in which our conflicts have their roots in that desiring and its escalation into violence. The importance of mimesis as a description of our pre-conscious reality in which all of reality lives, and which precedes and defines every thought and conscious intention of our actions. And the way in which we solved our problems by scapegoating others, and the way in which we had our unity and solved our own internal problems by uniting on a common scapegoat, were all critical insights into our reality. And in this little community, the way in which in the gospel, a language with which we were already familiar, spoke directly and very practically to that situation, offering us a lifeline to find a way through the madness of mimetic escalation. These insights we applied rigorously and repeatedly to our actions, emotions, and thoughts, sitting together, thinking about our actions and experiences, and exploring ways forward. By doing it together, we developed our own mimesis with each other, with the models, with the thinking that we would carry, with the models in the thinking that we would carry into the circumstances of our lives, and learn to return to these as we made our own mistakes and got caught as ever in the rivalries around us. Time and again, we were obliged to recognise ourselves in the models of rivalry, model obstacles, scapegoating, and desiring, above all in rushing to occupy the high moral ground of goodness. Only afterwards, and only for those in an academic bent, did we get to Girard pure. I was one of those who made that leap, and I've lived my life in the gifts this journey gave me, and I spoke to the count, or is to blame for why I, someone from a small corner of an island in northwest Europe, was sitting in Mexico City talking to you today, so you have to blame. In doing so, we learned, it was drummed into us by our beloved Dutch teachers, that we were not different people in the sense of being better than all the devils surrounding us, but only had possibilities because those had been given to us by the gospel speaking to us in community, which sometimes held us from the abyss and gave us a basis of trust as we took steps into the future. We had, quite literally, an experience of being saved from the madness of the world around us, not through any desert of our own, and of returning into the world as people who had been given the possibility of being born again. In this community, born, I have to say, in allergy to the language of evangelicalism, the meaning of these cliches had ironically become the meaning of our existential experience together. I've laboured this autobiographical introduction not to point to a special, although as in every story it's unique, but to make two bigger points. Peace is not a thing. It is not a noun with a clear shape, or, if you will, in the language of Rabinovich, a totality. It is a reality in our relationships. It appears not because we build it, but because when we are together in a certain looking and gaze and spirit, called in the Christian word the Holy Spirit, something appears. It's not for nothing that all the wise people in the world suggest that if you want peace, go and serve the poor. The point not being that we should patronise the weakest, but that the humanity of the weakest keeps the rest of us real, rather than the other way around. Secondly, and also, peace is not a universal ideology owned by its believers to be imposed on our neighbours by a saving political power, but a concrete reality that appears or does not appear in the lives of human beings, but appears when we recognise each other beyond our rivalry, and it can spread. Mimetic theory tells us that desiring is a contagion, because desire reacts and spreads. By implication, peace, like violence, is similar, a contagious possibility that cannot be forgotten once it has been seen and heard, and can be imitated. The possibility of liberation from mimetic violence and the spread of peace is better conceived of, in my view, as a self-replicating virus can spread outside the control of government and company and can touch all, but most profoundly targets the most vulnerable. So to expand the focus from intimate personal experience to the practical the search for peace in the public space, Northern Ireland was, and in many ways is, a society in which relationships are inseparable from the political rivalry over its existence. There always has only been one question in our political life: to be or not to be. That is the question. As in all identity politics, when that becomes the question, nothing can be negotiated, because to negotiate is to negotiate being. People enfold their personal identity within a wider social identity, in which any change in the balance of power around identities are lived as matters of profound personal insecurity. Paradoxically, as so many, but certainly Girard has observed, extremity in identity politics hides not a strength, but a feared collapse of ontological security, driving protagonists to the extreme, in which the extremity of the visible commitment is a function not so much of positive identity as a fear of the looming collapse of the mediator within which I have my sense of self. What makes Northern Ireland unusual is only its location. A tiny territory of little intrinsic interest to the outside world, in which the rivalries that consume it inside have been largely contained there. Those rivalries cannot, of course, be separated from the rivalries of surrounding peoples in Ireland and Great Britain that evolved into full-flung confrontation in the early 20th century. Yet for both, Northern Ireland became the container of those rivalries in both senses of the word contain. As they sought to step back, it allowed them to continue in a way that apparently kept the sacred national flame burning, and yet contained them in a way as to limit the spread of those rivalries and to enable responsibility for any violence to be abandoned and placed solely on local protagonists. In mimetic terms, Northern Ireland was the minus of the plus in its visible capacity to repel its mimetic appearance rather than attract them. But in its ongoing tensions, it remained a deep reality between them, awaiting only the escalation of violence to demand attention. I explain this, again, only to say that our experience of violence was contained by the shared interest and strategic calculations of its neighbours. Northern Ireland conflict did not, as other ethnic conflicts, become a mimetic magnet, drawing in the mimetic conflicts of large powers, but remained an object of horror and fascination as its violence escalated, exploded, and entered a holding pattern in a manner which allowed its mimetic and reciprocal nature to be made visible. The fact of being of little interest turns out to have been important in being able to see. On the one hand, Northern Ireland had, at least in relative terms, a boundary within which both an outside and an inside could be observed at once. As a result, both the pattern of escalation to the extremes in the form of a duel became between increasingly similar protagonists was glaringly obvious from the outside, while the polarization of both parties and their shared conviction of their absolute and irreconcilable difference was the narrative of the inside. On the other, the facts that outside powers did not intervene capped the escalation of violence within the limits of the violent capacities of groups and states acting within these boundaries. As a result, the dynamics of mimetic violence could be observed before they reached their final logical apex. Violence in Northern Ireland therefore took on the pattern of an ever-turning internal circle lasting 30 years, rather than the catastrophic escalations that consumed other places, Syria, Sudan, and a short and dramatic crisis that consumed Yugoslavia in the 1990s, let alone the devastating violence unleashed in Israel, Gaza, and its potential to spread into a regional and global war. It turns out, and I mean this without any flippancy at all, that we have been very lucky. I do not want to spend my time today examining the complex and specific path of Northern Ireland's internal politics. But because it is my lived reality, it has inevitably functioned to some extent for me as a personal laboratory of the question of what reconciliation is and how we might get there. Girard drew attention to two things, both of which appeal directly to our circumstances, and particularly to those within a small community seeking reconciliation in the midst of this crisis. Firstly, the obvious political crisis could not be understood within the confines of either humanistic liberal or Marxist political science, but had to be located within a wider anthropological context. And secondly, the absolute mimetic interdependence of apparently polarised partners on each side, and their mimetic insistence on the decisive importance of historic entry for current behaviour. What had to change first was our relationship. Relationship, it turned out, was primary to any change in being. Crucially, by emphasising that being rooted in relationship and that violence was the consequence of the escalation of mimetic violence, the Eura's thinking was transformed in our context from a scientific analysis of the nature of human desire and conflict into a vehicle forcing us to consider how we, as people committed to reconciliation, might reconfigure how we understand ourselves, what actions we might take, and how we might be understood or misunderstood. So the rest of my remarks today, using this very specific experience as my context for my thinking, are directed to assessing how Girard's insights help us to edge towards a new understanding of what is entailed in seeking reconciliation, and what light that throws on the now global enterprise of so-called peace building. Given the scale of Girard's work and the knowledge of this august audience, I do not want to simply repeat René's thesis to you there, and you can hear it already there, so I'm going to do some of that. But I do want to underline some of the building blocks which were particularly important to us. Mimesis is our reality. Mimesis is our reality. There is no being in which we are not, in the language, interindividual. Ultimately, the categories of enlightenment social science, the individual with fixed categories, and the collective with an identity, are both distortions. We exist as people, each specific rather than individuals, in relationships, never in isolation, in which both our personhood and belonging are interdependent. Mimesis is holistic, involving all of our reality, preceding consciousness and thought and creating the context in which thinking is possible and shaped. Self exists in the context of other and others, and our future depends on the health of relationships, not getting what we want, as the liberal drive for freedom suggests. Change in our reality is always a change in relationship, never a matter of the isolated self. Change from conflict to violence does not depend on whether we are mimetic, but on who or what we are mimetic with. Freedom has to do with finding a relationship in which we are able to be together in relationships of mutual regard, allowing each of us to find our place, and indeed, as Silvana described, taking the responsibility to ensure the place of the other. Attempting to change ourselves alone always has something to do with rivalry. Secondly, because human violence is a fundamental problem arising as a direct consequence of the escalatory pathways of mimetic desire. In mimetic rivalry, we become more similar, and our lives become increasingly consumed by the fascination of our rivals and the elimination of all other aspects of reality. In fascination, all that matters is to overcome our rival. Only when we are free of this mimetic fascination can we see the degree to which we have become, can we begin to see the degree to which we become consumed by the power of our relationship. As the power of structures and institutions come more and more under threat, the end of violence has to do with freedom from the fascination of desire. As Girard said, we have entered an era when anthropology will become a more relevant tool than political science. Because violence is mimetic, it is always experienced as reactive. Violence is always rationalised as a legitimate response to the provocation of the other. For the protagonist, it has the quality that it's always secondary, never primary. It is always, in some sense, revenge. To end violence is therefore inevitably, at some moment, to some extent, to forego revenge. Our experience of life together, despite this mimeticism, has been made possible by the emergence of human culture. Human culture rooted in the channeling of the violence of the mimetic desire of the group against another. Cultural peace is rooted in violence against the scapegoat, establishing the basis for cultural order. The dramatic experience of the consequences of this expulsive violence gave birth to a sacred order, in which a miraculous peace is maintained through the mechanisms of ritual repetition of sacrifice, strict adherence to rule structures, in which each person has a distinct and separate place within the social order, as a means to prevent rivalry, a shared myth in which the scapegoat becomes a god within the sacred order with power over life and death. Our lives within culture can be mediated by these rituals, myths, structures and laws, within which we can have peace as long as everyone sticks to their place. But it is also fundamentally ambivalent. The possibility of peace secured by the sublimation and elimination of its roots in violence. The sacred order, above all, cannot survive the exposure of its continuity with violence. And here comes a final point. Finally, and for now, the critical exposure of the sacred system entered the world in the history of the Jewish people. Proclamation of a God who is beyond violence, who transcends the social order, and who cares for all of his creation, is made possible the experience of a people who exited the culture of Egypt, became slaves throughout the city, became slaves in Egypt, and were marked for scapegoating, yet became chosen to proclaim a new reality. Their experience is decisive. Life in the context of, in mimesis with, the God who rescued the scapegoats from violence is life in a relationship which all our rivals desiring disappeared. All of our longing for ontological security is satisfied not by violence, but resting, as Augustine has it in this conviction. For as long as we're in this relationship, we are safe, we have trust, we have, as Deuteronomy puts it, chosen life. Ritual, memory, law, and the rules of society, all the ways in which society embodies itself, had to be rethought in the light of this revelation and written on the heart and the bodies of the people. In reality, as is shown with candour, the people return to violence, rivalry, and scapegoating with alarming speed and regularity, and it is only in some possibility of return that we can find our way through. And I'm not sure how much I want to go on here. How much time do I have? 15 minutes, so I should be okay. I have to rush here. The claim that Jesus is the Christ, the promised Messiah who saves, comes from the conviction that those who were his disciples, from the conviction of those who were his disciples, that he made this vision, the same vision, concrete. In the crucifixion and the resurrection, the Jewish conviction was put to the test, becoming the embodiment of the truth, the way, the truth, and the life that Israel had been seeking and exploring for centuries. This is the man who is no longer tempted, but lives in his relationship with his Father and makes available to us the possibility of walking in a new way of faith, which we can define now as memory and expectation, if we accept his forgiveness. If the Exodus proclaims the love of God for the victims, the Gospel proclaims the place God has for the perpetrators in the triumph of love over death and forgiveness over revenge. Critically, Jesus exposes for his followers the ambiguity of the law. To fulfill the law, he is crucified under the law, and because it is exposed, he therefore both fulfills and abolishes it. That is not to say that the new community can live without rituals, memories and rules, but these must now be transcended by the commandment to love God and neighbour, otherwise it is left the source of its being. Ultimately, for me, the Christian claim should be understood as a return to the orthodoxy which the Jewish people had incubated, rather than as a dismissal of its primary insight. What does all this do about our thinking about peace building and the crisis of polarization across the world? First, the problem of violence is indeed as old as human communities. As Girard comments in A Chevy Clausus, and I use that term because I think it's a better title than the English title, there is no difference in nature between machetes and missiles, only in degree. The problem, as the gun lobby reminds us, lies in human beings, not guns. But the problem, as Girard points out, is already a matter of apocalyptic risk if it is carried out in the context of nuclear weapons. I realise that some people here recoil at the extremity of Girard's final verdict, book, but for me it is really an important wake-up call. Northern Ireland confirmed for me at least the urgency and significance of the choice between violence and reconciliation, precisely because of the scale of the violence and the erosion of cultural protections against it. Indeed, this, not the choice of the winner in the rivalry, is the real choice. At the level of political theory, Girard's rejection of the Hegelian presumption that conflict is the route to reconciliation is, in my view, of groundbreaking significance. Against Hegel's presentation of reconciliation as a state in history which requires the preceding sacrifice, Girard emphasises on Clausewitz's nearly temporary insight that conflict is the pattern of a duel which escalates to the extreme. As Clausewitz wrote, if one side uses force without compunction, undeterred by the bloodshed it involves, while the other side refrains, the first will gain the upper hand. That side will force the other to follow suit. Each will drive its opponent towards extremes. As a description of Gaza is hard to beat. After Napoleon, Girard politics was already failing to prevent this escalation in Europe. Importantly, unlike the dream of humanism, Humpty Dumpty cannot be put back together again by politics without a genuine anthropological change. Writing in the 1990s, as the Northern Ireland peace process emerged, Seamus Heaney, a poet later awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, intuits what is at stake in a poem that has become a cliche in Ireland, and I'll quote some of it. Human beings suffer, they torture one another, they get hurt and get hard. No poem or play or song can fully right a wrong inflicted or endured. This is our predicament. Then later in the poem he says, history says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that a future further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells. Heaney, as a secular poet, intuits deeply what is at stake and the quality of peace as a miracle against the backdrop of the violence people are seeing. Ultimately, he tries, in my view, to rely on so-called self-healing. But his location of peace on the far side of revenge and his famous impossible contradiction from within the paradigm of rationality that hope and history will rhyme, that these places on the right track is where we measure change. Girard's book carries an unmistakable sense of foreboding, which is of a piece with the gospel insight that Jesus comes to bring a sword. And, in a sense, this is where intellectual analysis reaches the boundary of faith. I come from a community of people who I now see approach this conundrum from the other end of the telescope. Girardian theory was a way of making sense of what they knew from the gospel, in which the task was not to curse the darkness, to light a candle, or perhaps better, to spread the light of the candle they were holding. The interesting question was not the scale of the problem to be faced, but what could we do about it? Girard's insight that the only thing that is really new is if we walk in the world in the light that reveals forgiveness, in my message of Jesus in our language, shines with our very limited possibilities. Time and again we had our own experience of transformation and revelation. Both of forgiving and of our own complicity with violence. When the search for peace finally became a wider social priority, it gave us two things. A confidence that we knew that we might recognise reconciliation when we saw it, and a small size which made us utterly harmless, if not terminally naive. Precisely this harmlessness gave us the possibility to carry risks for others, or to suggest things which for people caught in rivalry were unexpected. Even having a physical place where conflict was relegated to a second-order consideration was unexpected. Our task, indeed our ability, was not we had no ability to construct a new political order, but to engage with our brothers and sisters as we tried to do so, as we all tried to do so, from the perspective of people living out of the conviction of the importance of not rivaling and not scapegoating. Convinced that peace is not primarily concerned with stopping violence, but with establishing new relationships. For a long time we could do nothing, and then opportunities arose, some of which created possibilities for others. Importantly, however, change did not depend on scale. Czesław Miłosz, the one of the Polish writer, worries in the end Dostoevsky's scout troop, as he calls them, who gather at the end of the Brothers Karamazov, are no match for the Grand Inquisitor, and on some level we all share the skepticism. But the Gospel and the story of the Jewish people tell another story, which is that size does not matter. Indeed, maybe more, change only comes from the marginal and forgotten and ridiculous, from Moses against the Pharaoh and Jesus against the crowd. In a mimetic system, the vehicle for change can be anyone. Of course, those with visibility have more immediate possibilities, and the point is that the story and example of the human face belongs to each of us. Crucially, although change is non-violence, it is apocalyptic. It is eventually a choice between the truth about our violence and its denial. It is the same choice as Deuteronomy, life or death. And its only possibility is through what Norbert Nozick, who used to come to these conferences, described as contrast culture rather than counter-culture. Confrontation comes through difference, not similarity, through what might be called perpendicularity rather than opposition. Leadership in this view is reconfigured from political or social position to the truth articulated from weakness by the scapegoat. Truth-telling, judgment, mercy, and restorative justice in a single movement. We only leave the mimetic vortex if, in my opinion, we are forced onto another path by meeting the face of the victim, the suffering other as is a stumbling stone, a scandal. The New Testament story of crucifixion and resurrection is a dual declaration. The revelation of the violence system and the declaration of the triumph, in my terms here, the human face. The rupture of the track we were on that this brings is so sudden that it can indeed be described as violence. Paul on the road to Damascus is the example, but within it is an inherent paradox. This violence is the inbreaking of non-violence. It is possible that we can be richly prepared for this encounter by education, but it does not produce the violence of the arrival, but it may provide resources to recognise it and to act. In this sense, the Gospel follows Jesus as he engaged with his opponents, moved from an adversary, in a sense within structure, within the debating law of Judaism, towards hostility as the structure fades. Jesus, in contrast to his opponents, does not escalate, which only provokes his opponents more to the point of uniting them in a plot under colour of legal process. Rather than avoid the confrontation, he choreographs it to emphasise and expose the contrast. Jesus is the immovable object in the face of the unstoppable force. Crucially, it is non-reciprocal with violence, so as to create a new possibility of reciprocity with love. I entirely agree the words positive and negative minded, and I'm still in the world of moralism, so I would prefer mimesis that leads to humanity, with the scapegoat, with the suffering other, and the mimesis that leads towards death, which is the mimesis of our desires. And it is the contrast, the difference, that survives death. Truth is only visible after the confrontation with violence. Instead of the triumph of violence, it is the resurrection of the human face, repeating the Exodus experience of the survival of the slaves after the confrontation with Pharaoh's army. So we do not have to stand in judgment of brothers and sisters with military responsibilities of instincts. Girard's connected to, but definitely not the same as pacifism. The key to the important distinction is to refocus our attention away from violence to the underlying mimetic relationship. Violence cannot be solved at the level of violence, but only by reducing the level of escalated mimetic desire. Peace is not the absence of violence, but the transformation of our relationships. Until now in the world, the task of those responsible for sacred order, the origins of our modern political order, was to reduce the mimetic frenzy of unstructured violence. We heard about Confucius. By counterposing structured violence, Caesar had its function. In the Gospel, soldiers are not directly condemned. It remains the case that state acted in pursuit of universal rules of the duty to protect their citizens in this way, and World War II is a standing example for the Europeans. It also lies in the continued hope of a violence that upholds human beings. However, the effort to prevent the spread of madness of Russian aggression, or to manage the violence that has broken out in Gaza or with Israeli settlers, still claims to be within structure. However, and this is the big risk, the risk of being drawn into the same violence that we proclaim to oppose is more present than ever. In Northern Ireland, the state is set into shooting its citizens on the street to defend others. In the war in Gaza, the enormous risk for both Israel and Palestinians is to be drawn into being mirror images. The risk facing the West in Ukraine is at what point the rightful demand for the rules to be upheld meets the fact that nothing can be achieved through the use of force. In a sense, it is already common cause that the West can do nothing about the plight of the Uyghurs or Hong Kong Chinese, let alone the people of North Korea. And there is little doubt that the invasion of Iraq did nothing to enhance the prestige of law, but destroyed it. All of these are dilemmas opened up by the exposure of violence, and all of them increasingly back to Girard's apocalyptic choice in the Chevy Clausewitz, which so scares so many here. It is really quite simple now. Either we find our way to love, forgiveness, and mimesis with the God of the scapegoat, or we continue with our progress with the cause of violence. After Girard, the task of seeking peace is no longer measured simply by the absence of violence, but by the absence of mimetic rivalry, in which the level of violence is the critical indicator, but not the problem itself. This is, as I understand, precisely Girard's point. Our modern problem is precisely this. Peace can only be pursued as a journey into the anthropological reality of rivalry, not by enforcement of peace through war. In practice, I know from Northern Ireland the implications of the pursuit of reconciliation are profound. Everything formed in the light of hostility has to be rethought. Everything is learning to do what we don't know how to do. And everything opens up new reasons for returning to the old ways. Sadly, the nuclear apocalypse may be an event, but reconciliation is not. It has to be walked and rewalked. On the other hand, every new opportunity is an opportunity for its change. For as long as life goes on, there are many possibilities. Perhaps above all, keeping to the task is hardly possible on our own. The need for a community where truth, memory and forgiveness can be relived and reminded remains central as a way to avoid being overwhelmed. So I have a very final paragraph now. There is no doubt in my mind that the situation is urgent. There is also no doubt in my mind that Girard has opened up ways to think about peacemaking which offer genuine possibilities outside those of international humanitarianism or political institution building, or to put it more optimistically, which make the dreams of humanitarianism possible and make us think about how political institutions might be used as vehicles for peace. In this sense, Girard is importantly separate from politics and offers opportunities for concrete engagement in almost every setting. The suffering victim suffers the conundrum of the need for external mediation without violence. More problematically for humanism, by pointing to the importance of relationship in providing ontological security and making change possible, Girard says the possibility of deciding to take up a yoke. Danny's constant reminder that Girard is not the full possession of institutional Christianity is vital. What matters is mimesis with the God of the scapegoat, however that's conceived. Furthermore, this God faces historic Christianity as a contrast, exactly as he is a contrast for all the rest of his children, revealing, I'm afraid, not good people, but people whose future too is only possible in humility and forgiveness. And when Jesus invokes his followers to take the yoke, he is reminding them that change will not happen by thought, but only mimesis with the reality beyond the polarizing crisis. Girard was right to worry that his thought could be instrumentalized into politics by his readers, and fought to ensure that an anthropological frame of reference remained intact. On the other hand, it's my conviction that his work offers an immensely practical resource and guide for being honest about a predicament and seeking practical steps to walk our way into a new freedom. Peacemaking is the inbreaking of the human face, of the human person whose weakness we recognise and serve. And crucially, none of this can be imposed. It can only be shared to be shared. Peace, like all the important things, freedom and justice is an invitation into a relationship rather than an object to be enforced.